Indiana Jones, It's a podcast about Indiana Jones. Every movie, 1 minute at a time. The Indiana Jones Minute.
Welcome back to the Indiana Jones Minute. This is the podcast where we're still sitting here just to see if Nick Fury shows up at the end. And I am Tom Taylor.
I'm Pete Milbert.
I'm Gerald Christopher St. Briomaglis, St. Brioc to his friends, patron saint of purse makers, and he once stopped a plague.
Aww.
He was also, I know.
He hit it with his purse.
He was...
Knock it off, you plague.
He was also known for the legendary size of his almsgivings.
Aww.
Get your mind out of the gutter, Peter. Actually, that's literally what it said when I read about him. That's kind of setting me up for a saint there. Known for his legendary size of his almsgivings.
I like the description you read had ellipses there, too. That's
Yes. Porter.
And we are here today to discuss minute 123 of the rapidly disappearing Last Crusade. 123 begins with the credit for special effects floor supervisor, and it ends with the credit for special effect editors.
I think my favorite name of all the credits is the camel and horse master, Bronco McLaughlin.
Oh, that is a really good name.
You got to think if your parents name you Bronco, your career's kind of laid out for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds like a made up name. It sounds like a comic book character or something.
He does.
It's awesome.
Yeah. Unless he's
absolutely.
like a Max Bangwell kind of character.
Max Payne. I actually loved Mr. Connery's makeup artist, which is Ilona Herman. Which, once again, I love as a complete sentence. See, that was... Ilona Herman. Hey, Ilona Herman. So, that's my theme here. I'm trying to find the complete sentence names.
That's beautiful.
That was my favorite.
Meanwhile, I'm just trying to find my own name, and I found it twice in this minute. There's a prop store man, Tommy Ibbotson, and standby rigger Tom Lowen. Still no Jodies or Sams. Oh, well.
Maybe they're coming.
Maybe.
I do want to give a special shout out to Simon Atherton and Bapty and Company, because Simon was the armorer for the movie, and he also was on Raiders, but not Last Crusade. And Bapty and Company provided all the armor, like both the medieval armor and like the guns and everything. And it's interesting, they're still around and still provide everything from, like, if you go to their website, like everything from guns to pole axes to movies and TV all over Europe.
Cool.
So yeah, it's cool. There's a company that's all they do.
Wow. Speaking of, all that you do, I had a hard time with the name Joseph Dipple.
I think you had a hard time with him in the past too.
With I remember Joseph Dipple.
Yeah.
It came back. It came back kind of like a little bit like a dipple.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't get to.
Yeah.
It's like neither a dimple nor a nipple, and I wondered if that was like your nipple gets a cute little crease when you smile. That would be a dimple.
Or if it's just like an innie nipple or something, so it's a dipple.
It's a dipple.
Yeah.
I also really like the name
Indiana
Lil
Jones
Hey
Minute,
Man.
everybody.
They're the secretary to Steven Spielberg was Lil Hey Man.
I like that too.
Yeah. Lil Hey Man.
Big feller Heyman wasn't available. He was on a different job.
Do you think that Frank Henry, the carpenter on the film, kept making jokes about his cup?
He said, "No, really, you can borrow mine."
Yeah.
No, but it'll actually be, you don't have to do all this Hollywood shim sham. It'll actually be.
Oh, we finally fade to black in this minute too. The sunset goes away.
Yeah, right before we do, Christy Porter, in one of her more difficult to answer, I think, this just in questions, sort of referenced the four horsemen of the apocalypse.
All right.
And they kind of look like the four horsemen of the apocalypse galloping into the sunset here. And speaking of the apocalypse, Jerry and I had the very distinct pleasure of talking to a very interesting guy that I've admired for a long time, Dr. Phil Daileader from the College of William and Mary. And if you've ever listened to any of the great courses, he did 3 of my very favorites. He did one on the Crusades and 2 on the Middle Ages. And we started off when we talked to Phil talking about, there was a book that came out recently talking about the Crusades and how the people involved in the Crusades thought that they had actually brought about the apocalypse.
Oh, man.
Well, wait a minute. I hear Phil riding up right now.
Hey. I had one book that I thought I might bring up, but I wasn't sure if you'd read it. It was Armies of Heaven by Jay Rubenstein.
Now, first of all, I'm an academic, so not having read a book poses no obstacle to my speaking about it at length.
Okay, good.
And if you're going to get by in this profession, you got to learn how to talk about stuff you've never read. Now, fortunately, I have read Jay Rubenstein's book.
Okay.
It's thought provoking. I'm not certain what to make of it in some ways. It's one of those books that you kind of have to ponder for a while. Because one of the problems with the Crusades is sometimes you think this has been studied to death. People have been poring over these records. Is anybody ever going to come up with something new to say? And I will say that one of the nice things about that book, with its focus on the just how strong the apocalyptic element is in the Crusades, it does take a new point of view on it, or maybe not entirely new, but it does make you think again about material that you're familiar with. So that's a great accomplishment. I think the book is a fine accomplishment, and I do recommend it to anybody who wants to read it.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I wasn't sure, because it seemed a lot different than anything else I was listening to.
Yeah, it is. It's it's not your standard treatment of the Crusades, but it is. But nonetheless, he's a well-respected scholar, and he does cool, good, careful work. So everything he says deserves great consideration.
Now there was another book that we discussed briefly on the show. It was William Manchester's A World Lit Only by Fire. Do you think that kind of oversimplified or painted too bleak a picture of the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages?
I do. And I think that my official line is that you shouldn't really care that much about what you're studying as a historian, which is an odd way of approaching it. But I do think that you don't want to get too emotionally invested in what you study, because then you develop blind spots and you take sides. I've often thought that the historical profession would be best served if everyone was randomly assigned a field. And you just basically, it's kind of like Plato's Republic, where they're choosing the guardians and their wives. You would just take all the historians in the world and all the topics in the world, and you would put them in like this giant lotto machine, and our ping pong balls would bounce up. And that way we'd be studying stuff just for the sake of studying the stuff, not because we feel any personal need to defend it or to attack it. That having been said, when you've studied a period for a long period of time, almost despite yourself, you wind up developing some sort of attachment to it. And I feel more sympathy than anything else for people who live in during the Middle Ages. It's just a physically, biologically demanding time to be alive. But at the same time, they're not that removed from us. They are us living with some different assumptions and other very different physical conditions, but they're still us. They're not so far removed. So works that overemphasize how different things were 1,000 years ago or how different people were, I'm not always that sympathetic to.
Huh. Wow, that's fascinating.
Fantastic. Yeah.
When you just as an example, if you're at a red light and your mind wanders, and say it wanders to the Crusades.
That's right.
And and maybe it's a big intersection, so it's a long red light.
Well, in Virginia, we drive politely. In my native New York, it was more the Eastern Front that came to mind most of the time when we were driving around. But I'm sorry, I digress. Please go ahead.
Well, what makes you, when you think that the Crusades is, or the Middle Ages, that's us today. I mean, what do you see alive and well from the Crusades, or something specifically that impacted? I know it's a lot, but is there one or two things particularly that you go, hey, I'm looking at this today, and this is exactly like the Crusades,
Yeah,
or makes me think back, or even a religious war or something, tensions.
I'm going to give you an answer that is tantamount to professional suicide, and I'm kind of prone to do this. My answer is nothing. I see almost no connection beyond a set of symbols that are invoked from time to time to try and justify current political and economic tensions. And I think one of the things that gets people into the Crusades is they hear about them. They hear presidents speak about Crusades, and they hear foes of the United States speak of the Crusades. And, certainly after 9/11, the word crusade seemed to be on everybody's lips. And some people evoke the word because they think it has positive connotations, and others use it as a form of criticism to attack others. But to my thinking, there's no direct connection between the conflicts of the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries and those of the 20th century because of something called the 14th to the 19th centuries that intercede. If you want to know what caused the 20th, you got to look at the 19th. Want to know what caused the 19th, you look at the 18th. You can find some indirect echoes, perhaps. But there's a reason why when I did that Crusades course for the teaching company, and we had a lot of discussions about this, and not everybody kind of was on the same page in terms of where the course should end. But I said, I'm ending in the 15th and 16th centuries because that's where I see direct impact. I don't see it in the 19th and 20th centuries. To me, the geopolitical situation, the cultural situation is so different today. During the Crusades, the Near East is wealthier than Europe. It is culturally more sophisticated than Europe. The flows of cultural influence are going from the Near East to the West, not in the other direction. And that just creates a very different dynamic. There is no Israel, no equivalent to Israel in the 12th and the 13th centuries, which also adds another level of complication to things. So apocalyptic expectations, to get back to Jay Rubenstein's book, struck me as being somewhat lower today. And so people like to describe themselves today as Saladin or as being on a crusade, but the reality of it is there's no equivalent of oil in the 12th and the 13th centuries. There is no industrialized economy that required a commodity from the Near East. So even though, yes, there is conflict between the East and West in the Crusades and conflict between parts of the East and parts of the West now, to me, they're very, very different situations. And one of the reasons why I teach the Crusades is to cut them down to size. And that's what I mean by professional suicide, because we tend to be rewarded for hyping our results, for emphasizing as strongly as possible just how relevant they are. But sometimes I think the scholar's duty, the historian's duty, is to say, no, they're not as relevant as you thought. It's not great for book sales, but sometimes I think that's what you got to do.
Can I just say, one of my favorite things about doing this podcast is sometimes asking a question and getting an answer that is so far removed from what you expected. I love that.
I'm known to do that.
That was amazing.
I don't know that my students are always that thrilled, but they're generally quite kind. So
A couple of them get up and walk out. In the middle
Oh
of
no, we're all
first
right.
week.
No, not at William and Mary. No, we're very respectful.
Yeah.
Very respectful here.
So one of the things like we focus on in this podcast, we've been talking about Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and in your courses, in your lectures, you talk about there are three main orders of knights: the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights.
Right.
Were there other smaller orders devoted to more arcane pursuits, kind of like these guys in the movie, or is that a completely made up?
Oh,
idea
there are smaller religious orders and military orders that often wind up being absorbed by the larger ones, in part because they go broke and they can't sustain themselves financially. Probably the most arcane military order is one that was one of the first ones, which is the Knights of St Lazarus. Those were knights that had contracted leprosy. And so
you're
it was
kidding.
probably not a fun order to join. And
I mean,
and they wound up
pretty soon you lose your arm.
yeah. I mean, it's nice that somebody's taking care of them. But yeah, there was a military order, the Knights of St Lazarus. It was one of those that gets absorbed by the more mainstream and the better funded military orders. So yeah, there are some smaller groups.
Well, and another thing that you talked about that really kind of I found fascinating was about Peter Bartholomew when they were in Antioch, finding what he said was the Holy Lance, and kind of this, they gave the Crusaders hope, or they thought it was a religious sign, and sort of like the same thing that happens in these movies of people searching for relics. But were there knights who focused on looking for relics, like these guys looking for a Holy Grail in this movie?
Not with sort of the obsessiveness of an Indiana Jones. When the opportunity presented itself to grab some relics, you'd grab them. The sack of Constantinople being a great example of that in 1204. The idea of traveling all the way around the world, trying to locate a single relic, no, not outside of literature, in part because, there were other efficacious relics that were much easier to get a hold of. So why would you go through all the efforts of trying to get just one if there were others that were near at hand? The Peter Bartholomew incident during the First Crusade is one that I like teaching to students because it does open up a side of the Middle Ages that they're perhaps not expecting. Peter Bartholomew says that he's found the Holy Lands when the Crusaders are trapped at Antioch. The Crusaders break out of Antioch because they're so enthused by this discovery. What the students are often surprised is how much skepticism there was about the whole thing. That there are people there trapped in Antioch who say this is a fraud. This is not the Holy Lands. You planted it there. There's already one of these things in Constantinople. How many Holy Lances do you think there are? You do find intense piety and devotion in the Crusades. You're also going to find a certain amount of skepticism from time to time, religious skepticism that people are sometimes surprised to learn existed in the Middle Ages, that there were people who had questions about relics, about miracles, questions that are not all that far removed from ones that someone might pose in the 21st century. And I do think it's beneficial for students to see some of the skepticism, because it helps them, again, to understand that the Middle Ages are not a simple time.
Wow. Were there people on the Crusades who were skeptical as far as the whole religion business
You're not going to get I don't think you get anybody on the Crusades who would be, say, a 19th century, unbeliever or a professed skeptic. But you certainly find a fair number of folks who come close to cynicism at times about the enterprise. I think Bohemond on the First Crusade comes close to it. He would have a sort of a conventional piety, but he's not really motivated by it. And of course, the Crusaders are a very self-selecting group. We have to remember that the vast majority of people didn't do this. They heard the sermons, they heard the calls, and they said, no. They stayed home. They decided to...
I'll take my chances on the plenary indulgence.
Yes, maybe or what I'll do is I'll start pestering people to give me indulgences without having to do all the work, which is what eventually happens. But so you don't want to take the skepticism too far. I've yet to encounter some. Well, I take that back. There are some peasants who say some things that suggest that they actually are kind of atheists. In the Inquisition records. But by and large, you don't get anybody who goes quite all the way and says, I think all of this is hokum. But you do get people who ask some very sharp questions about specific objects and specific practices, which shows a real critical sense.
Wow. That's
well,
cool.
you open in the introduction to the great courses, how the Crusades changed history. You have a quote of a famous historian. I believe it's Sir Stephen. Is it Runciman?
Yeah, Runciman, sure.
Runciman, and I'd just like to read a little bit of it here because I thought it was just an amazing quote. There was so much courage and so little honor in the Crusades. So much devotion and so little understanding. High ideals were besmirched by cruelty and greed. Enterprising endurance by a blind, narrow self-righteousness. And that sounds, that blew me away. But I think that ties in a little bit with some of what you're saying, that there was some cynicism there. And it does seem like, as you mentioned, sort of a brutish period, a difficult period, a demanding period, morally and physiologically.
Yes, I think that's right. And Runciman was one of the great writers, stylistically, of the 20th century. His narratives are beautifully, beautifully crafted. At the same time, I think one would be within one's rights to challenge that statement a little bit. There is a moralizing to it that I suspect a lot of historians of the Crusades these days would not be comfortable with. And I sometimes pose to my students the question, do you think most Crusaders went for money or for religion? And inevitably, the majority of them say money. And I come back and say, I don't think that's right. I think there were some who were looking to cash in. But I suspect that the majority of those are genuinely devoted to the ideal that Jerusalem has to be under Christian rule, that it's a place where Jesus lived and died. And the thrust of research over the last couple of decades has been pointing in that direction, mostly because we now have a far better understanding of what it cost people to go on crusades. You can reconstruct the financial arrangements that people made back in Europe before they go, and they just wrecked themselves. They sold everything they had. They mortgaged what they had. They go into immense debt to finance expeditions that they might not live to see the end of. And if they were thinking that they were going to see a big return on all this debt that they amassed, even if they thought that after the first crusade, they weren't going to think it after any other crusades because they saw what happened. And yet they did it. And yet they took on these financial burdens. And as we've come to understand just how people wrecked themselves financially to go on these crusading expeditions and continue to do so generation after generation, or sometimes by going on a second or a third crusade, it suggests that it's not just pure materialism that is driving your rank and file crusader.
So do you think that it had to do with how they viewed their own moral turpitude? Or guilt, just straight up Catholic guilt? I mean, I had 12 years of Catholic education. I'm ready to go on a crusade. I got to clean some things up. Right.
Look, you're never going to out Catholic me. I was an altar boy. I was an elite altar boy. I was like all dioceses 3 years running. I was so good as an altar boy.
Well, there you go.
But I do think
so you get it.
That to some extent what's driving this is the importance of Jerusalem. the symbolic importance of Jerusalem. People heard about it all the time. They heard it in their prayers. They heard about it in church. It just looms so very large in people's thinking and imagination. And I suspect that a lot of what's driving the Crusades is just the simple belief that Jerusalem should be Christian. This is where Jesus lived. And therefore, it should not be under Muslim rule. It's been under Muslim rule for 400 years at the time of the First Crusade, but the statute of limitations apparently does not apply. And so we're taking it back. Part of it does have to do with the penitential system. That medieval penance it's not like today. It's pretty formidable. And you could easily find yourself so far behind that you were never going to get it all done. It's impossible. You've racked up 400 years of penance. You're not going to live to be 400 years. So now what do you do? Well, that's where crusading indulgences come in. They create something new. They give you a chance to escape the consequences of your earlier actions. To get a movement as big as the Crusades going, and then to keep it going for several centuries, it took a lot of factors coming together in just the right way. Whether it is the possibility of financial gain for some crusaders, the penitential system, and its demands, the importance of Jerusalem. Big things don't just happen in history, I think. It often takes a lot of different factors lining up in just the right way, and then something big happens. And I think that's what happened with the Crusades.
Well, it's fascinating. I mean, guilt and absolution as a commodity traded in a way. Was the Children's Crusade as fun as it sounds?
No, there's nothing fun about the Children's Crusade.
We talked about this, a little bit on the show, and I think we were a little irreverent.
Yeah, that's fine. Oh, that's fine. But I like teaching the Children's Crusade mostly because my students, it's the most crestfallen they are throughout the academic year. They come in brutal. so excited that, they have patiently listened to me talk about the Baltic Crusades, knowing that we're going to get to the Children's Crusade. And then we get to it, and it's 15 minutes because it only lasted one summer. And all they do is they walk. They walk from Paris to the Rhine River Valley, and then some of them walk to Italy. And then some of them go home, but some of them don't. And that's it. And by that point, we're like in the 9th week of the semester, so they can't drop the class. It's far too late for that. So they just have to sit there and listen. It's the high point of the year.
And like a carnival bar. Who wants to hear about the Children's Crusades? Come on in.
Well, they see it on a syllabus, and they zero in on it. So no, it was as Crusades go, it was not the worst. They don't attack anybody. They just walk. They just walk down to Europe. And students will ask, well, where are their parents? And that's a good question. Why are they permitted to travel from the Rhine River Valley down to Italy? It does have some historical significance. I think it's best understood as a rebuke of what crusading had become. By the time of the Children's Crusade, crusading has exploded across Europe. There are crusades being fought against pagans. There are crusades being fought in Spain. There are crusades being fought in southern France. There are crusades being fought in Germany. And the problem with crusading is it's too successful. It was so good at mobilizing people that the temptation is just start calling crusades every time you have a problem. It's too powerful to resist. And so you have this explosion in the number of crusades, and some people think that these other crusades are wrong, that every crusader who goes to fight the pagans in Lithuania is somebody who's probably not going to go to Syria to fight for Jerusalem. And so when the children say, we're going to Jerusalem, in a sense, they seem to have been reprimanding their elders, saying, you're not going to Jerusalem anymore, are you? You captured Constantinople 8 years earlier, and then you didn't leave again. You made no effort to get to Jerusalem. And that's probably because there are other of these popular crusades that keep popping up in the 13th century, where groups such as shepherds rise up. And it seems to be an expression of popular resentment against the people in charge of crusading, who had turned crusading to other purposes. At least that's a very elegant theory, and it makes some sense to me. So I'd go with it.
Wow. Well, and one thing you mentioned, the importance of Jerusalem, and you just mentioned Constantinople, which strangely doesn't really play any part in this movie we're discussing, The Last Crusade. But Venice plays a huge role.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, Venice doesn't seem to have, at least from what I've heard, played a huge part in the First Crusade. But is there a reason why they might have made it such a centerpiece of this movie, and why the knights who came back from finding the Grail would find themselves in Venice?
My guess is that Venice makes a great shooting location. And
bingo.
That's why I've done some work with television, and it's been very instructive to me. I've learned a lot because with television and any visual medium, unsurprisingly, or I shouldn't have been surprised anyway, you start with a picture and then you get the story. Whereas historians who write articles and books, we start with the story, and then if we find pictures, that's great. But if there are no pictures, it doesn't bother us. When I did this, the History Channel did something called the Dark Ages. It's probably 10 years ago now. And, I was happy to be a talking head on it. But what really interested me was just how they worked, because it was not at all how I would have worked. That for every segment, they thought first of what are we going to show? And then they thought of what are we going to tell? And I suspect it's kind of the same way with movies, is that you're like, okay, this is going to make a great scene here. Mm-hmm. And then we're going to we'll reverse engineer the story a little bit to explain how it is we all wound up in this one spot. So I'm just guessing here, but I would think that's probably how Venice wound up becoming the centerpiece. When, as you say, Venice it's involved in the Crusades. It's certainly central to the Fourth Crusade, but it doesn't really have any special claim to the Crusades as a whole.
Yeah. Well, speaking of a little Hollywood whitewashing, I'm dying to know when they introduce a lecture on the great courses, there's always a clapping after.
That's usually
bogus, isn't it?
It's the professor applauding for herself or himself, and then they multi-track it to make it sound like there are 12 of us, but it's really just us doing all of this.
I listen every time, and it's always like the same amount of clapping.
Yeah, it's the exact same.
But the clapping is always a little bit different.
Now,
I'm like, how do they do?
You're intimating that they're reusing a single clap track, when in fact it's just that the audiences are remarkably consistent in how they applaud. They always applaud in precisely the same manner for each professor. I'm quite convinced of that. Now, let me say, I love the teaching company. I kid because I love. I have enjoyed working with the teacher. I mean, I started in 2000 with them. So we're going on close to 2 decades now. I love the teaching company. I love what they do. It's been fascinating to see it evolve and change over time. But yes, there are a few little quirks to their to their presentations. That yes, that's right.
And I have 40 of them on my phone. Those great courses, everything from like the joy of science and like physics and you to the Persian Empire and your courses. And that's actually originally how I came across you. And then my sister was like, "Oh yeah, I know Phil," and I was like, "Oh,
he exists."
Yeah, I was like, "You're kidding me!" I was like, "You know Phil?"
Yeah, it's
so that's.
The teaching company is. I got in very early when they were not quite the juggernaut they are now, and that's probably why I got in. As a matter of fact, that they're at a fair, strange but true. they had sent one of their talent scouts to William and Mary to look at somebody else in my department. And the person really wasn't interested and was trying to get the talent scout out of her office. And I was a junior faculty back then, so I couldn't say no to anything. So she's like, no, I can't really help you, but why don't you go talk to that guy? And kind of sent her down the hallway to me. And the person didn't want to go home without having talked to anybody. So she just wandered into my office. This was not prearranged at all. And it's like, who are you? I'm like, oh, I'm Phil Daileader. I do medieval history. He's like, are you giving any lectures today? I'm like, yeah. So, sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes you get very, very, very lucky in life. This was, they didn't want me at all. They wanted somebody else. But, hey, put me in, coach. I mean.
Well, Jerry and I are both huge fans, and I'd love it if you wanted to tell the listeners where they could find some of these, or where they could, because they're absolutely fantastic, and they were essential research for us in learning about this before we started doing this podcast. We got them through Audible, or how they can find your great courses. Or
you can buy the DVDs and CDs used on various websites. That's very painful to people like me, because it's tough to see your life's work being auctioned on eBay with a minimum bid of $5. And you're like, wait a second. It takes me 5 years to learn that. And it's $5. And then nobody makes the minimum bid. And then you're like, maybe I'll do it. But then what if I get stuck with these things? So it leads to all sorts of dilemmas. But you can find them. You can find them in public libraries. And if you're just interested in dipping your toes into it, you don't want to make any commitment. Public library is a great way to do it. They have a good money back guarantee policy, which they do it too. I've seen them do that, and I've known people who return them. If you don't like it, they will give you your money back. But it's a wonderful thing that they put it together. There's a whole audience out there that academics couldn't get to 20 years ago, and now they can, and they have a pretty rigorous selection process. Now they do. Back when I got involved, it wasn't quite so rigorous. But now it is. I mean, you have to, and even back then, to be honest, you had to go through a lot of stages because it's an investment on their part. They can only release so many courses. They can't afford to release duds that don't sell. So, you go through a lot of audience testing, which you don't do in academia. But I do think the product benefits immensely from their approach.
It's changed my life. I mean, all of them have, and yet there's so many different courses. I mean, not only history, but I also wanted to say you do have a book. It was I love the title: True Citizens, Violence, Memory, Identity in the Medieval Community of Perpignan.
Very good. Yeah, that's the first one that came out. Came out of my doctoral dissertation 2000. So that was the tenure book. You got to get that done to get tenure. You could read it if you want, but the price is astronomical because it's published by a European academic press. I had one come out in 2016 on a preacher named St. Vincent Ferrer, and that's actually available in paperback, which means it's not insanely expensive. It's called St. Vincent Ferrer, His World and Life. It's a biography of a late medieval preacher. Probably he's one of the most famous preachers of his day. And so that's the most recent one. And I'm pretty happy with how that turned out. So if people were kind of looking to read something, I would probably start with St. Vincent Ferrer, just because it's cheaper and it's probably more accessible because it's a biography. You follow him from birth to death.
Awesome.
Well, I do have one final question.
Sure.
I'm dying to know, does my sister steal all the sugar packets from the faculty lounge?
Oh, look. I'm sorry, but that question betrays a remarkable lack of understanding of how academia works. Psychology professors and history professors don't have lunch with one another or share common facilities. We are in our hermetically sealed departments, and we try not to interact with one another. The reason I know Christy is because our kids went through the same daycare center. That's how the only way I know other faculty members outside my department is through daycare, basically, because we all had to drop our kids off and pick them up at the same time. So that's how we know one another. Now, I will say that at no point did I see Christy stealing sugar packets from the daycare center. I'm happy to report. Or juice boxes or anything else.
That just means she's really good at it.
Well, that's true. Yeah. I wasn't looking for it. Wasn't on my radar screen. So, and that ended about 10 years ago because kids get older as they do. So, so that's the best I could do with that one, I'm afraid.
Very, very good.
Well, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. I had a great time.
Oh yeah, this has been a lot of fun. This has been great.
Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot.
Hey! And speaking of William and Mary, speaking of stealing sugar packets, this just in from Professor Christy Porter.
Her satchel loaded down with sugar packets.
Is the comeuppance Indy gets from Elsa just desserts for how he treated Marion?
Wait, what was the comeuppance? What's the comeuppance?
Yeah, what is the comeuppance that he gets from her?
Oh, I mean, he's double-crossed. You know, he's lied to.
Oh.
You know, he's yeah. What do you mean? You guys
ago.
watched the movie?
That was like
No, I know, but we're talking about
15 years old.
general themes.
I don't know if I feel like that was comeuppance. I feel like comeuppance would be if she like dragged Indy down into the pit with her at the end.
Yeah, or if she had presented him with the baby that he ditched her with when she was 15 or something. I don't know.
Or maybe if it
raised him to be a Nazi.
Yeah. Or if he had maybe if he had gotten fired and Elsa was hired and given tenure.
Oh, there you go.
At Marshall College.
It's weird.
Maybe head of the department.
Almost everything you guys are mentioning shows up in the next movie.
Oh my really?
God. I honestly don't
remember any of this. Yeah, I have no idea.
Although I do remember the kid part. Yeah. Okay.
Indiana Jones gets fired?
No.
Don't answer that. Don't answer that.
Well, beautiful. Thank you, Christy Porter. Thank you, Pete. Thank you, Jerry. And thank all of you out there for listening. We're going to be back tomorrow with more. In the meantime, don't forget to visit us over at IndianaJonesMinute.com, where you can find all our past episodes that you may have missed, including all of Raiders, all of Temple of Doom, and increasingly all of Last Crusade, by golly. And you can also get a link to our Patreon page over there. And yeah, it's your one-stop shop for Indiana Jones Minute fun.
Including some little special things like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer.
Oh yeah, we got all that stuff over there from
some Star Wars movies.
I honestly forget, was that a Patreon one? No, that was an extra bonus one.
Yeah.
We sprinkle all sorts of fun throughout this whole thing. Definition of Dipple and Rudolph. The full spectrum of human experience. So come back here tomorrow for minute 124 of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade right here on the Indiana Jones Minute.
Hey, Pete.
Uh-huh.
I know Phil's great courses were some of your all-time favorites, but what was another one? What was your other favorite great courses?
Do it, Pete. Do it. Do it.
Do it. Do it. And you got to say it in a, well.
You need to bust my buttons. The bust of Nefertiti.
No, was that it? The Egyptology?
No, there was a great Egypt one.
That was
the professor was like also from Brooklyn or the Bronx or
yeah,
that was great.
That was I was gonna say that was my favorite one. The one on Egyptology.
Yeah,
that one was incredible.
Yeah, although I still think Phil's may be my favorite.
Oh yeah, those were great.
Yeah.
Crusades, and you specifically really like the early medieval history.